What does it mean for a city to disappear? Not to fade slowly into folklore, not to be conquered and renamed, but to be interrupted so completely that ordinary life is cut in half, leaving one side of history forever unfinished. Across the ancient world, people built where life seemed richest. They settled beside harbors where ships arrived, heavy with grain and copper. They raised walls near volcanoes because the soil was dark and generous. They laid streets across river mouths, coastlines, and valleys because trade, water, and sunlight gathered there. These places did not feel fragile. They felt chosen, and that may be the most haunting part. The cities in this story were not symbols of failure. They were functioning worlds. Bread was rising in ovens, scribes were sharpening reeds, merchants were tallying cargo, children were running through courtyards while fountains spilled into stone basins. In each place, people trusted the quiet routines that make a settlement feel permanent. Morning followed morning. Repairs were made, markets reopened. Life, in its most persuasive form, kept insisting on tomorrow. Then the ground shifted, or the sea withdrew, or the mountain breathed out what had been gathering in darkness for centuries. What remains is not only ruin, it is a record of interruption. Streets sealed under ash, temples resting below water, walls broken by heat, by sand, by shock waves no one could outrun or fully understand. Archaeology gives us measurements, dates, debris fields, fracture lines. But beneath those facts is something more intimate. The realization that every civilization, no matter how skilled, lives inside forces it did not create and cannot command. This is not a story about punishment. It is a story about limits, about the uneasy partnership between human ambition and a restless planet, and about the cities that still speak, even after silence claimed them. What if a city could vanish in less than a day, while its final gestures remained waiting in the dark? On the morning before Pompeii was lost, nothing appears to have announced the scale of what was coming. The town lay close to Vesuvius, but closeness had long since become ordinary. People had learned to live with tremors the way others live with weather. A shake in the floor, a crack in a wall, a repair half finished in the courtyard, these were inconveniences, not prophecies. Then sometime after midday, the mountain opened. At first, the danger arrived almost politely, pale stones falling from the sky, ash drifting into streets, a strange dimming of the sun. But catastrophe has a way of changing tempo. Soon rooftops were carrying more weight than they were built to bear. Passageways narrowed. Breathing itself became labor. The city's design, its shops, homes, bathhouses, and avenues, was still intact, yet already turning useless against the atmosphere that enclosed it. And then came the deadliest phase. Not lava creeping in plain sight, but surges of superheated gas, ash, and shattered rock moving with devastating speed. They entered houses the way wind enters an open room, except this wind carried suffocation and heat beyond the body's ability to endure. Many did not die in flight. They died in interruption, in a doorway, beside a wall, with an arm raised, with belongings still in hand. That is why Pompeii unsettles us even now. It was not only destroyed, it was preserved mid-sentence. Bread remained in ovens, graffiti held to plaster. Human absence took the shape of human presence, as if time itself had hardened around one unfinished day. We often imagine collapse as a long decline, something visible from a distance. Pompeii suggests another truth. Sometimes the world does not crumble gradually. Sometimes it closes all at once, leaving behind a city that still seems to be waiting for tomorrow. How fast can a life end before the mind has time to name what is happening? A few miles from Pompeii, along the curve of the Bay of Naples, Herculaneum faced the same volcano and yet met a different kind of ending. It was smaller, more polished, a place of elegant villas and shaded terraces where the wealthy came to rest near the sea. From its streets, the water must have looked eternal, blue, open, dependable. And for a few hours after Vesuvius erupted, Herculaneum may even have seemed spared. The early ash drifted elsewhere. Roofs did not immediately give way. Streets did not vanish under falling stone. In that temporary mercy, there was room for hope, and perhaps for fatal hesitation. Some residents fled. Others gathered valuables, waited for family, moved toward the shoreline, or simply watched the mountain from a distance, believing the worst had chosen another town. But volcanic disasters do not always arrive in forms the eye can interpret. Sometime in the night, Herculaneum was struck by pyroclastic surges, dense clouds of superheated gas, ash, and debris moving with terrifying speed. There was no long negotiation with danger, no hours of decision narrowed by collapsing roofs. The lethal force came as heat and pressure beyond human scale. It entered houses, storage rooms, and waterfront shelters in seconds. Those waiting near the boats were overcome where they stood. What archaeology later uncovered by the ancient shore is difficult to forget. Clusters of bodies in boathouses, the remains of people who seem to have been poised between escape and uncertainty. Yet what makes Herculaneum especially haunting is not only death, it is the violence of preservation. Wood carbonized but survived. Shelves, doors, food beams, and rooms endured because the same event that destroyed the town sealed it with astonishing precision. Herculaneum reminds us that catastrophe is not always a slow approach visible on the horizon. Sometimes it arrives faster than awareness, and when destruction moves more quickly than thought. Survival is no longer a matter of courage or intelligence, but of distance, timing, and the indifferent physics of the earth. What if the most unsettling ruin is the one where almost no one is left behind? Long before Pompeii and Herculaneum, on the island of Thera, there stood a city that seemed to understand both beauty and engineering with unusual intimacy. Akrotiri rose above the Aegean in painted walls and multi-story buildings, its rooms alive with color, ships crossing blue water, lilies bending in the wind, figures caught in ritual and movement. Beneath its streets ran systems for drainage and water that spoke of planning, patience, and a society deeply at ease with complexity. It was also a city living in the shadow of a volcano. The people of Akrotiri were not strangers to instability. Earthquakes had visited before. Buildings had been repaired, reinforced, adapted. In places, archaeologists found signs that damage had been cleared even before the final catastrophe arrived. This matters because it suggests something profoundly human. People recognized the tremors, responded to them, and perhaps believed a response would be enough. After all, adaptation often becomes its own kind of reassurance. Then the island entered a different chapter. The eruption of Thera unfolded in stages, and that slow build may have given many residents time to leave. Ash began to fall. The sky changed. The island must have felt increasingly unreal, as if familiar ground had started to speak in another language. Yet when Akrotiri was buried, it was buried with remarkable stillness. Rooms remained. Staircases held. Storage jars stood where they had been placed. Frescoes survived in color, sealed beneath deep layers of volcanic material. And still, the city feels incomplete in another way. There are almost no bodies, no crowded thresholds, no final poses fixed in panic. The silence inside Akrotiri suggests evacuation, but not safety. Beyond the island, the eruption likely sent tsunamis across the sea and shock through the wider maritime world that connected Crete and the eastern Mediterranean. Akrotiri leaves us with a quieter question than Pompeii. Not who died here, but where did they go, and what else was lost beyond the frame? Sometimes a city does not become tragic because it holds the dead. Sometimes it becomes tragic because it preserves the shape of life after life has already fled. Can a city be erased not by fire or water, but by patience, the patience of a desert that never stops moving? In the Roman age, Timgad rose in North Africa with the confidence of a ruler's blueprint. Founded under Emperor Trajan, it was a city of lines and angles, a place where order had been drawn onto the land with almost mathematical certainty. Two grand streets crossed at the center, an arch-framed arrival. There were baths, temples, homes, a library, and a theater carved into the slope. Timgad looked like permanence made visible. But permanence in dry country is always a negotiation. The city stood near the edge of the Sahara, where survival depended not only on stone and planning, but on systems that had to be maintained continuously. Water channels kept clear, agriculture sustained, labor organized, streets protected from drift. For a long time, Rome's structure held, yet environments do not yield forever to design. Climate shifts, diminished maintenance, and perhaps episodes of seismic stress began to loosen the bond between city and landscape. What happened next was not dramatic in the way volcanoes are dramatic. No single afternoon sealed Timgad's fate. Instead, the process worked in increments almost too small to fear. Wind pushed sand into courtyards, dust gathered in thresholds, abandoned walls trapped more sediment than inhabited ones. Roofless rooms became bowls for the desert. A storm could leave inches. Years could leave streets unrecognizable. That is the strange dignity of Timgad's disappearance. It was gradual, and therefore merciless in another way. A city built to express control was undone by the failure of continuity. Once labor thinned and infrastructure faltered, the balance tipped. Then the landscape took over. When excavators uncovered Timgad centuries later, the Roman grid emerged with startling clarity, as though the dunes had hidden it rather than destroyed it. And perhaps they had done both. The desert did not rage against the city, it simply waited. Timgad reminds us that collapse is not always an explosion. Sometimes it is what happens when the work of holding back the world is no longer possible. One grain means nothing. A million grains can bury an empire's certainty. What if it was ground beneath a city could forget how to be land? For centuries, Heracleion, known to the Egyptians as Thonis, seemed to belong more to legend than to history. Ancient writers spoke of a grand port at the mouth of the Nile, a threshold between Egypt and the wider Mediterranean, where merchants arrived under temple shadows and officials watched the traffic of empires pass through its harbors. It was a place of ceremony and exchange, where religion and commerce stood side by side. Then somehow it was gone. When modern divers and archaeologists found its remains beneath the sea, the discovery felt less like excavation than encounter. Massive statues lay on the seafloor. Temple blocks rested in silt. Fragments of ships and districts appeared in outlines that still suggested streets, quays, and sacred spaces. The city had not simply decayed. It had descended. Heracleion had been built in the Nile Delta, a region rich in life and trade, but geologically uncertain. Delta ground is made of waterlogged sediment laid down over centuries. Mud, sand, and silt compacted just enough to seem reliable. Yet under pressure, especially during earthquakes, that kind of earth can lose its strength almost instantly. The surface holds until suddenly it does not. What looked like stability becomes something closer to liquid. That appears to have been Heracleon's fate. Seismic shocks, rising water, and the instability of saturated soil likely worked together until foundations failed. Buildings tilted, broke, and sank. Entire sections of the urban platform slipped downward. Once the land lowered, the sea did the rest. Water moved in where streets had been, and the city's role as gateway to Egypt became impossible to sustain. There is something deeply unsettling in this kind of destruction. Fire can be seen, ash can be imagined. But foundational failure is quieter, more intimate. It suggests that a city may not need to be attacked at all. It may only need the earth beneath it to change its mind. Heracleion asks us to consider how much of civilization depends on surfaces we rarely question. Beneath every harbor, every monument, every avenue of trade, there is a more fragile truth. All permanence begins with trust in the ground. How does a city end when the warning arrives as a letter and no one comes in time? Around 1200 BC on the northern coast of what is now Syria, Ugarit stood at the center of a remarkable web of exchange. Ships moved through its harbor carrying metals, timber, grain, and crafted goods between great powers of the late Bronze Age. Scribes pressed words into clay with disciplined hands, recording treaties, inventories, debts, and messages that traveled farther than most people ever would. Ugarit was not isolated. It was connected in every direction, and connection itself was a form of wealth. That wealth made the city strong, but it also made it dependent. When archaeologists uncovered Ugarit's ruins, they found a destruction layer thick with fire and collapse. Walls had fallen. Roofs had come down. Archives had been baked hard by the same heat that ended the lives around them. And among those tablets was something unnervingly intimate, a plea for help written as danger approached. The message survived. The rescue did not. For a long time, the fall of Ugarit was told mainly as a story of invasion, part of the wider turbulence that rippled through the eastern Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age. And that may be part of the truth, but the earth itself may also have been involved. Evidence from the region points to powerful seismic activity around the same era. In Ugarit, some patterns of collapse suggest sudden lateral force, as though the city was shaken before it burned. A tremor could have shattered walls, blocked streets, and turned ordinary fire into an urban catastrophe. And behind both possibilities, violence from outside, instability from below, there was another pressure already underway, strain across the larger system. Drought, failing harvests, disrupted trade routes, and political uncertainty may have left the city with fewer reserves than its elegance implied. Networks can make a civilization flourish. They can also make collapse travel. That is what gives Ugarit its modern feeling. Its end was not necessarily one thing, but many things converging faster than recovery could organize itself. A port depends on roads. Roads depend on order. And order depends on food, labor, trust. Ugarit reminds us that cities do not always fall because one wall breaks. Sometimes they fall because too many invisible threads snap at once. And by the time the message is sent, the silence has already begun. What if the sky itself became the weapon, and the city never had time to understand what it was seeing? In the Jordan Valley near the northeastern edge of the Dead Sea, there once stood a fortified Bronze Age city now associated with tall el-Hammam. It occupied a strategic plain, defended by thick walls and positioned along routes that linked regions of the ancient Near East. From its towers, the settlement must have looked secure, organized, elevated, and prepared for the familiar threats of its age. Armies could be imagined. Drought could be measured. Trade could be managed. But some dangers do not belong to the usual vocabulary of history. Excavations at the site have revealed a destruction layer unlike an ordinary urban fire. Walls appear violently broken. Pottery surfaces show signs of extreme heat, in some cases partially transformed into glass-like material. Certain minerals found in the debris suggest intense pressure and temperatures far beyond what conventional Bronze Age warfare could easily produce. The evidence has led some researchers to consider a startling possibility that the city was devastated by an airburst, an explosion in the atmosphere caused by a cosmic object breaking apart before impact. If that interpretation is correct, the event would have unfolded with terrifying speed, a blinding flash. A wave of heat capable of igniting surfaces in an instant, then a pressure front strong enough to flatten structures from above and hurl debris across the city. Unlike a siege, there would have been no time for defense. Unlike an earthquake, there may have been no warning carried through the ground. The catastrophe would have come from overhead, swift and almost incomprehensible. Some parts of this story remain debated, and that uncertainty matters. History is not served by turning interpretation into certainty. Still, the site preserves a sobering truth whether the mechanism was cosmic or not. The forces that shape human survival are not limited to politics, war, or even the earth beneath our feet. Tall el-Hammam invites a humbling thought. We build for the threats we know. We fortify against enemies we can name. Yet every civilization, no matter how disciplined, also lives under a larger sky, one that occasionally reminds us how small our plans really are. Can a city drown slowly enough that its people mistake the warning for inconvenience? Along the western coast of Italy, near the Bay of Naples, there once flourished a Roman resort unlike any other. Baiae was a place of villas, gardens, and thermal baths, where the powerful came not to govern, but to indulge. Senators and emperors walked terraces above the sea. Marble halls opened to private views of the water. Warm mineral springs rose from the earth below, turning geology itself into luxury. It was a city built on pleasure, and perhaps because of that, it felt insulated from ordinary forms of danger. But beneath Baiae lay the Campi Flegrei, a volcanic landscape less famous than Vesuvius and in some ways more deceptive. Here, catastrophe did not arrive as an explosion. It moved through a process known today as bradyseism, the gradual rising and sinking of the ground caused by pressure changes deep below the surface. To a resident, the shift might have seemed subtle at first. A dock sat lower in the water than it once had. A floor developed a persistent dampness. Salt crept where fresh water should have flowed. Yet for a coastal city, such small changes are never truly small. Elevation is destiny. Over time, parts of Baiae began to subside. Foundations settled unevenly. Lower rooms flooded. Harbor structures lost their balance with the shoreline they had been designed to serve. Archaeological remains now visible beneath the sea tell the story with unusual clarity. Columns marked by marine organisms at different heights, statues resting underwater, corridors and pavements preserved in green light below the surface. The sea did not attack Baiae, it inherited it. That may be what makes Baiae so quietly unsettling. Its decline was not theatrical. It was geologic persistence crossing the threshold of human use. Once water entered too far, once the infrastructure no longer worked as intended, abandonment followed. Stone survived, social life did not. Baiae reminds us that some endings are not announced by smoke or fire. They arrive by inches, by cycles, by the slow revision of the boundary between land and sea. And when that boundary shifts enough, even a paradise can become a ruin below the tide. What can 1 minute do to a city that took centuries to build? In 526 AD, Antioch was one of the great urban centers of the Eastern Roman world, a city of trade, ceremony, and density. Colonnaded avenues ran through crowded districts. Churches rose above markets. Warehouses, workshops, and homes pressed close together in a place alive with commerce and argument, prayer and routine. It was the kind of city that seems too large, too central, too established to disappear quickly. But Antioch stood near a fault line, and fault lines keep their own calendar. The strain had been gathering invisibly for years, perhaps for generations, far below the ordinary noise of the city. Then, in late spring, the earth released it. The shaking would have arrived without warning, violent lateral motion traveling through stone, brick, timber, and human bodies all at once. Walls that had carried weight for decades cracked along their weakest seams. Towers failed, roofs collapsed inward. Streets that had organized civic life became corridors of falling debris. Yet the earthquake was only the first sentence. In the confusion that follows structural collapse, fire often finds its opening. Lamps overturn, cooking flames spread. Water systems fail when they are needed most. In a tightly built city, broken by tremor and blocked by rubble, flame can move faster than rescue. Antioch appears to have suffered exactly that sequence. Shock, collapse, then burning layered over ruin. What the earthquake destabilized, the fire completed. There is something especially sobering about Antioch because its destruction was so mechanical, so immediate. No ash preserved it, no sea swallowed it. It was broken by physics in plain sight. 1 minute of released strain became thousands of private tragedies unfolding across the same streets that had been busy only moments before. Antioch reminds us that scale is not protection. Population, wealth, prestige, none of these alter the behavior of stone under sudden force. A great city may feel permanent because so many lives depend on it, but when the ground itself moves beyond what its structures can bear, history can pivot in less time than it takes to say goodbye. What happens when the sea steps back just long enough to make people forget it is gathering strength? In 365 AD, Alexandria stood among the great cities of the Mediterranean, a place where commerce, scholarship, and empire met the water's edge. Its harbor was not merely a waterfront. It was an engine of connection, receiving ships, storing grain, and tying Egypt to distant populations that depended on its stability. Breakwaters, quays, warehouses, and civic buildings gave the shoreline an air of command, as though stone could negotiate with the sea. Then, far beyond the city itself, the seabed moved. A massive earthquake struck near Crete, deep along the tectonic boundary where one part of the earth presses beneath another. Such ruptures do not remain local. When the seafloor lifts or drops suddenly, the water above it is displaced, and that displacement begins traveling outward with enormous energy. By the time it nears a coast, what began as motion in the open sea can become a wall of force. Ancient accounts describe a moment of eerie reversal. The sea withdrew from parts of Alexandria's shore, exposing spaces usually hidden beneath the water. Ships were left stranded where they had floated moments before. One can imagine the confusion, the temptation to step closer, to look, to interpret this as spectacle instead of warning. But the ocean had not retreated in surrender. It was gathering itself. When the wave arrived, it carried more than water. It carried timber, ships, stone, mud, and impact. Harbor structures were smashed. Vessels were thrown inland, Buildings already weakened by tremor met a second assault from flooding and hydraulic force. In a city built around maritime exchange, damage at the shoreline did not remain at the shoreline. The harbor's injury became the city's injury, and beyond that, the region's. Alexandria survived, but survival is not the same as immunity. Part of its ancient edge was altered, submerged, or lost to later coastal change. The event remains a reminder that the sea which feeds a civilization can also revise its boundaries in a single morning. And when the horizon goes strangely quiet, that silence may be the beginning of the loudest thing a city will ever hear. Why do so many lost cities seem to have been built in the very places most likely to betray them? By now, a pattern begins to emerge from the ruins. These cities did not rise at random. They were founded where the world was most generous, along fertile volcanic slopes, beside river mouths rich with trade, near thermal springs, harbors, and crossroads of sea and land. Ancient people were not reckless. They were practical. They built where crops grew well, where ships could dock, where routes converged, where water, heat, and commerce made life possible. The danger was often inseparable from the advantage. Volcanic ash creates rich soil. Deltas invite trade and agriculture. Coastal shelves offer maritime power. Tectonic corridors open valleys and springs that attract settlement. What appears over generations to be a good location can also be a waiting place for forces moving on a much longer clock. A mountain may sleep for centuries. A fault may remain quiet beyond living memory. The sea may respect a shoreline long enough for a civilization to mistake stability for certainty. That is one reason these stories feel so modern. Human beings are experts at adapting to familiar discomfort. A tremor becomes routine. A little flooding becomes manageable. Cracks are repaired. Seawalls are extended. Systems are adjusted and daily life resumes. Adaptation is one of our finest traits. But sometimes adaptation also teaches us the wrong lesson. It can persuade us that because a risk has been survived before, it will remain survivable in the same way forever. The ancient cities in this story reveal something more subtle than simple vulnerability. They show how prosperity itself can deepen exposure. The more a city thrives in a strategic landscape, the more roads, warehouses, temples, homes, and memories it anchors there. Leaving becomes harder. Warning signs are absorbed into normality. And when the threshold is finally crossed, the loss is not just physical, it is civilizational, because the very networks that created strength now amplify disruption. Perhaps that is the hardest truth to accept. We do not only build in dangerous places by accident. Sometimes we build there because dangerous places are also the places where life, for a time, becomes most abundant. What do ruins really preserve? The past itself, or our uneasy recognition that the future is never guaranteed? When we look at the remains of these cities, it is tempting to see only endings: ash-filled rooms, harbor stones beneath green water, walls cracked by sudden force, streets hidden under dunes. But ruins are more than evidence of destruction. They are also records of ordinary confidence. Every oven, doorway, mosaic, warehouse, and drainage channel tells us that someone expected life to continue. Someone invested in tomorrow. That is why ancient catastrophe feels intimate across so many centuries. The people of Pompeii were not living in a cautionary tale. The merchants of Ugarit were not aware they stood at the edge of a historical threshold. In Alexandria, the harbor workers moving cargo that morning could not have known the sea was already in motion beyond the horizon. The residents of Baiae, Antioch, Heracleion, and Akrotiri each inhabited a world that still made sense, until suddenly or gradually, it did not. What archaeology gives back to us is not only the scale of disaster, but the texture of interrupted normality. There is a human instinct to search these places for lessons simple enough to be comforting. Build elsewhere. Prepare more. Read the signs. And those lessons matter up to a point. Yet the deeper message is less convenient. No civilization, however sophisticated, escapes dependence on larger systems: tectonic, climatic, hydrological, cosmic. We live by interpreting patterns, but nature is not obligated to keep those patterns legible on human timescales. And still, these lost cities do not leave behind only fear. They leave behind testimony. Frescoes survive. Tablets endure. Streets can be traced. Even in collapse, something of human attention remains visible. How people organized a room, stored grain, painted a wall, arranged a public square. Destruction did not erase their humanity. In some strange way, it revealed it more clearly. Perhaps that is the paradox of ruins. They remind us that permanence is fragile, yes, but also that meaning does not depend entirely on permanence. A city can vanish and still continue speaking, not because stone lasts forever, but because the human effort to build, remember, and understand leaves an echo even time cannot fully silence. So where does this leave us, standing at the edge of these vanished streets? Perhaps with a quieter understanding of history, not as a procession of empires rising and falling by will alone, but as a long conversation between human intention and a planet that never stops moving. The cities we have followed, Pompeii, Herculaneum, Akrotiri, Timgad, Heracleion, Ugarit, Tal el-Hammam, Baiae, Antioch, Alexandria, were not failures waiting to happen. They were achievements. They were evidence of intelligence, cooperation, ambition, beauty, and trust. And still, each one met a limit it could not negotiate. That is not cause for despair. It is cause for humility. The modern world often speaks as though knowledge has placed us outside the old vulnerabilities. We map faults, monitor volcanoes, model coastlines, and watch the sky with instruments ancient people could never have imagined. These are real powers, hard-won and necessary. Yet the deeper lesson of the lost city is not that knowledge is useless. It is that knowledge does not cancel dependence. We still build near shores. We still cluster along rivers, deltas, and seismic belts. We still trust systems that work beautifully until the day they do not. And yet we keep building. That may be the most human truth of all. We return to unstable ground not only out of forgetfulness, but out of hope. We build where life gathers. We choose beauty despite risk. We create harbors, homes, archives, temples, roads, gardens, and songs because the possibility of meaning has always outweighed the certainty of control. The ruins do not mock that instinct. In a strange way, they honor it. So the final question is not whether a city can last forever. None can. The question is what kind of wisdom we carry while building the next one. Can we remember that stability is precious because it is temporary? Can we design with reverence for forces larger than ourselves? Can we hold progress and fragility in the same frame? The lost cities remain with us because they are not only about the past, they are mirrors held up across time. In their silence, they ask whether we have learned to live not with fear, but with awareness, and whether memory itself might be one of the strongest foundations we have.